Hey everyone, in this video lecture, we are covering the topic of chromosomes as well as this thing called ploidy, which relates to number of chromosomes in a cell. So first we need to talk about what chromosomes are. And if you understand DNA is the genetic material that you inherit from your parents. Chromosomes are just packages of DNA. The DNA has been wound up super tight. It's very compact, condensed into a little package that almost has the shape, kind of like a little pinwheel, if you will. And there are multiple chromosomes in a cell. And that means there's multiple packages of this DNA. And within your DNA, there are sections that we call genes. And genes are what determine which traits you have. Which version of a gene will indicate if you have blue eyes. If you have a different version of the gene for eye color, you might have brown eyes, and so on. So we say that your genes that you've inherited, which are in your DNA, that is your genotype. It is which version of a gene do you have. And your genotype is what determines the physical trait that we see, which is your phenotype. Okay, so again, you might have a version of a gene for the eye color gene that makes your trait show up as blue eyes, whereas some people have the version of the gene for eye color for the trait of brown eyes. So the genotype, the actual version of the gene you have, determines your phenotype. And so this relates to chromosome number, where ploidy is just the vocab term here that refers to the number of chromosomes that a cell has. And so cells can either be diploid cells or haploid cells. And so diploid, think di, the Latin root there referring to two. We have two copies of every chromosome in the cell. Whereas haploid cells only have one copy of each chromosome in a cell. And the reason this matters is diploid cells, the two copies that there are of every chromosome, we have homologous pairs. So there is a section of your DNA that represents chromosome number 1. So there are two copies of chromosome number 1. And each copy is inherited from the parents of that person or organism. So one copy of the chromosomes is inherited from the egg that created this offspring, and one set of chromosomes was inherited from the sperm that created this offspring. So there are two copies of every chromosome. One set came from the egg, one set came from the sperm. So these homologous chromosomes, this term referring to the fact that we have two copies of the same chromosome. So again, chromosome number 1 is a certain section of your DNA. There is a copy of it inherited from the egg. There was a copy inherited from the sperm. We call that pair of chromosomes homologous chromosomes. I want to clarify, this bit is a little confusing, that you have two homologous chromosomes. They're in a pair. After DNA replication, this single chromosome has now two sets of chromatids that are connected together. So this is still one single chromosome, but it has two chromatids. Same thing with the dark blue here. That was one chromosome before DNA replication. After DNA replication, it has that sort of X shape to it. That is because there are now two pairs of sister chromatids. This is still two chromosomes, but four chromatids. Okay, that can be a little bit confusing, especially thinking back to mitosis and meiosis with DNA replication. So haploid is different than diploid because there is only one copy of every chromosome in a cell. So instead of having two pairs, instead of seeing those homologous pairs, there's only one chromosome for chromosome number 1, one chromosome for chromosome number 2, and so on. So overall, these cells have half the amount of DNA compared to diploid cells. And so this is important because of the types of cells that especially humans have. And we can group cells into two categories. Somatic cells, which are the cells that are typically your body cells. They make up your organs, they make up your tissues, things like muscle cells, skin cells, blood cells, nerve cells, and so on. Whereas your sex cells, These are specific types of cells that are used for reproduction and passing DNA down to offspring. And these two types of cells have different ploidy numbers, different amounts of chromosomes. Your somatic cells must be diploid. Every somatic cell will have 2 copies of every chromosome, whereas sex cells, they are used for reproduction. They have half the amount of DNA. They only have 1 set of each chromosome. And this is important because you want your sex cells to be haploid. And that's for when a sperm and egg, each of these are sex cells, having half the amount of DNA, having only 1 set of every chromosome. When the sperm and egg join during fertilization, you have this newly formed zygote that now has 2 copies of every chromosome. So fertilization is the process where 2 sex cells combine, typically sperm and egg, if we're talking humans. Each haploid sex cell has 1 copy of every chromosome. And when they combine during fertilization, that new cell that is formed will have 2 copies of every chromosome and will be diploid. This diploid zygote will then go on and divide, and cells will differentiate into skin cells, muscle cells, hair cells, and so on. And those cells will always have the 2 copies of every chromosome. So soon we'll go through how these sex cells are created and how they end up with only having half the amount of DNA. But just to make sure we understand the difference between diploid and haploid, pause the video here. We have some different species listed in the left column. In the middle column, you're going to identify the number of chromosomes that they would have in their diploid cells. And then in the last column, the number of chromosomes they would have in their haploid cells. So the first row is completed for you. In humans, their diploid number, which if N was representing the number of chromosomes in a cell, diploid always has 2 copies, so it's 2 times N. The 2N number for a human is 46. So our skin cells have 46 chromosomes. Whereas haploid cells in humans, the N, the single number of chromosomes, there's only 1 copy of every chromosome, would be half the diploid number, which in this case is 23. So for the rest of the species in this table, you are either given the diploid number or the haploid number. So what you need to do is pause the video and you're going to fill in the blanks with either the diploid or haploid number based on the information provided. So pause the video here and give it a try. And here is the answer key so you can check your work. Make sure that you came up with the correct diploid and haploid numbers for each of these different species.